Well, as Ukrainian president says, he wants to do everything in his power to stop the destruction and protect the civilian life. So that's why he engaged in these negotiations. They actually describe them, I think, more appropriately as consultations at this point to see what Russia has to offer. And Russia, it looks like, by all accounts, continues to maintain completely unrealistic position. Apparently, they demanded as a precondition for these negotiations that Ukraine capitulates, which, of course, Ukrainians rejected. And then they agreed to meet without preconditions, and that's why we had this meeting. I think Russia completely underestimated what they're going to face in Ukraine. As you were showing, I would add further that even if you look at the map that your previous guest showed, sort of where Russian forces now are, actually, what does it mean if they're in a particular city? We have footage from Berdyansk in southern Ukraine, where angry residents surround Russian column tanks at the front square and essentially curse at them to go away. So to say that even if they enter the particular locality, that they actually control it would be great exaggeration. So I think Ukraine is actually, I mean, again, to the surprise of many in the world, is doing surprisingly well, right, as many analysts would agree. And I think it is not going to concede. The help is pouring in. And I think, Putin would have to face a choice whether indeed to escalate dramatically, which would lead to tremendous cost of life, destruction of the cities, just like your previous speaker was saying, bombardment of residential areas. That is not only, of course, terrible from humanitarian standpoint, I think it's also very risky, because in Russia there is not much appetite for this activity. I wouldn't even exclude some sort of palace coup to remove Putin in not too far future. But basically, yes, so negotiations are, I think, definitely, generally speaking, a good step. But I think at this point it is too early to say that they would lead to some sort of negotiated settlement that would be acceptable to all parties.
Oksana, you actually brought up a very interesting point, and that of the Russians' appetite for all this. I want to ask you about that. How you think Putin's standing domestically at least is looking like? I mean, it is a country where it is difficult to express opposition, but we know that there have been sporadic demonstrations, and Alexei Navalny's movement has called for a campaign of civil disobedience. I mean, could this gather any real momentum? I mean, how is the sentiment likely to affect the president?
Yes. Well, I personally wouldn't count on Putin being toppled by popular protests. I mean, it is, as you said, has been very repressive society. Putin really suppressed all and any political opposition or civil society opposition. So these brave Russians who are protesting are getting arrested and facing stiff fines. And we had, a few thousand people protest in a country of 170 million. I think many people either believe the propaganda that they've been fed through Russian TV, or they're just too afraid of protest, or both. But certainly there is great dissatisfaction, and it can only stand to grow as Russian economy collapses, as the ruble collapses. Sanctions have been imposed. But I think it would begin to create discontent among the elites, and that's more important because Putin really, yes, he seems to make all the decisions. He's been very isolated, but ultimately there are people around him. There were attempts to assassinate Hitler. I wouldn't even, say that that's a fantastic scenario, that somebody in the Putin's inner circle may decide that that basically has gone too far, and the benefit of keeping Putin in power may actually begin to look less, valuable than the benefit of removing him.
Oksana, when you and I began chatting, you mentioned the military campaign. Let me ask you about that. The Congress in the United States has approved more military aid to Ukraine. Now, the European Union has agreed for the first time to jointly finance weapons deliveries to a country at war. This is what we're seeing for Ukraine. But they're not sending in boots. Nobody is. I mean, is this the right approach to fund a war that they're not involved with?
Well, of course, from the Ukrainian standpoint, if, there was support in, boots, as you said, that would only be welcomed. But Ukrainians didn't really count on that. I think what they are counting on, nobody, I think, in Ukraine was sort of unrealistic to expect that NATO would fight for Ukraine. I mean, that's not what even the president ever asked for or anybody in Ukraine hoped for. But what we do see, however, we see now many volunteers who would go to fight for Ukraine, not as part of the government force, but as part of, volunteer force. Ukraine formed, I think it's called now International Battalion, where basically foreign citizens who want to fight for Ukraine can join this battalion. I think, according to Ukrainian reports, the first day over 100,000 people, or some really large number. I mean, again, we can sort of, decide to trust or not trust these numbers. But the bottom line is that it seems like the well of support for Ukraine in the West is almost kind of bottomless, from the military assistance in the hardware to the people who are willing to fight. And Ukrainian army, I think, has proved itself to be a very capable fighting force. Ukraine has hundreds of thousands of people who served in the military in the Donbass conflict before, so there is great also reserve. So again, it sort of goes to show how far is Putin willing to go. Is he willing to turn every major Ukrainian city into Aleppo or Grozny to take, to take Ukraine? I mean, that would be really the only way that he could possibly, again, take the land, but even not the people. So I don't think, again, I remain hopeful that he would be stopped before we face this kind of scenario.
Oksana, let me finally ask you, what do you think President Putin's end game is?
Well, his end game, he made it very clear. He believes his own delusions about Ukraine. He believes Ukraine is not a country, that Ukrainian people are really Russian people. He wants to establish control over Ukraine and to create, as he sees it, Great Russia. I think there is no delusion that it's sort of about NATO expansion or some sort of Russian objective security concerns. He wants to destroy Ukraine as a sovereign entity because it goes against his view of the world. So that's his end game in Ukraine.